are all the little bits clicking into place. All right. Excuse me. Just make sure we've got it all set up, and we'll give it a minute for people to log in now that it's up and running on YouTube. All right. Hold on, cleared my throat. But I guess it needed one more cough. Okay, let's get down to work. We are here in Acharei Mot Kedoshim, the middle-ish of the entire Torah, which has a huge amount of material because this is a double parasha. But as always, we can't cover everything, so we're going to cover something. In this case, it's going to be in chapter 19, and we're going to start off at verse 11, although that's not going to be our focal point, but we need to have a little compare and contrast. So as we go through these verses, I'd like you to be watching out, not just for the content, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but for any linguistic clues that something is a little different. It's very easy during these chapters to sort of treat the litany of different mitzvot as though it was all just, well, one thing after another, a literal list. But the Torah is written with more subtlety than that, and with more, well, I'm sure the original author, capital A, thought obvious clues that we were meant to derive additional information from the presentation, not merely from the content. So let's see how well we can hone that skill today as we begin with verse 11 and keep our eyes open for the lane change. All right, verse 11. You are not to steal. You are not to lie. You are not to deal falsely, each man with his fellow. All right, a common theme that comes up in multiple different ways to address different potential forms of our misbehavior with each other. Verse 12. You are not to swear by my name falsely, thus profaning the name of your God. I am Adonai. And there was our first switch. Now, this is not this is one we've talked about before, but let me go ahead and draw your attention to it before again. When we see the phrase Ani Adonai at the end of a verse, this is usually associated with verses where the particular transgression is something that might only be noticeable or discoverable by the person making the transgression. Potentially, we can uncover a false oath, but very often we are asking for an oath when there is no additional evidence. And therefore, the likely situation is that if you wish to swear falsely, you'll probably get away with it, which is why the Torah will often append, I am Adonai, as a reminder that although the human judges will not be able to detect your lie, God certainly will. And so we have this additional reminder. But that's not our big lane change for today. That is a fairly common one. Verse 13, we continue. You are not to withhold property from your neighbor. You are not to commit robbery. You are not to keep overnight the working wages of a hired hand with you until morning. Very important that Judaism has always stressed the idea of a fair relationship between worker and employee in a bi-directional sense. The worker owes the employer their labor, and the employer owes the worker their wages. And neither is allowed to withhold that in a manner which is a transgression. In particular, if you say you'll pay at the end of the day, don't ask them to come back tomorrow. Pay them at the end of the day. Verse 14, you are not to insult the deaf. Before the blind, you are not to place a stumbling block. Rather, you are to hold your God in awe. I am Adonai. Again, we see this appended phrase, Ani Adonai, because insulting the deaf, well, the deaf person's not going to know what you said because they are deaf. Likewise, who will know that you put the block in front of the blind? They are blind after all. But God is the answer to both those questions of who will know, and so it is a reminder there. Verse 15. You are not to commit corruption and injustice. You are not to lift up in favor the face of the poor, and you are not to overly honor the face of the great. With equity, you are to judge your fellow. In justice, we are doing justice. And while we have an obligation to help those that are poor, we do not do so through the miscarriage of justice. If a person is poor but guilty, then we deal with that guilt. If a person is poor but does owe a debt, then we deal with that correct judgment about the debt, even as we, outside the limits of the court, will work to help them pay it so that it is not disastrous. And of course, it shouldn't have to be said, but it all too often must. We do not show deference to those that are already honored. If someone is the greatest sage in the entire country, and they come before a judge because there is a dispute over property, over a loan, over some other activity, we do not show deference to the sage, no matter their greatness. We instead make sure that we adjudicate perfectly fairly in every case. Verse 16, you are not to traffic and slander among your kinspeople. You are not to stand by the blood of your neighbor. I am Adonai. This is a general statement regarding the, I'm sorry. Computer decided to bring up a alert in the middle of the class. There we go. Now I'm back to what I'm trying to do. This is a general reminder that while action is often required and inaction is often required when we are inactive from stealing and we are active to help the poor, there are also circumstances where we are perhaps likely to consider ourselves a bystander. And this is not something that Judaism abides, that we must act when someone else is in danger. If somebody is in a peril and we are standing next to the river, we throw them the life preserver. Important, we don't have to actually kill ourselves to save them, but we do have to do everything within our power to help somebody that is in danger, because we cannot stand by. Literally the phrase, by the blood of your fellow. Now, you might be asking, well, wait, isn't this a fairly obvious thing? Why do we need Ani Adonai? Why do we need this phrase at the end? We've said that's just for things that are often hidden within our own heart and that are not accessible to a human judge or to the society's judgment. Well, the fact is that oftentimes we will convince ourselves that we are just a bystander who could do nothing, when in fact we could. And then when we are in that mode, we must stop and reflect on God and reflect on indeed what power God has given us and ask ourselves if we are truly being honest. Are we actually able to help in this situation despite our misgivings, despite maybe personal risk and personal loss? Should we instead be helping? A very important question to ask ourselves at any time when we think fading into the background would be the best option. Verse 17, you are not to hate your brother in your heart, rebuke. Yes, rebuke your fellow, that you not bear sin because of him. Very important juxtaposition of terms here, that when we are commanded to not hate someone, we are still commanded to provide rebuke. And this, in fact, teaches us how rebuke must be given. I've talked about this in more detail elsewhere, but the short version is that when we give rebuke, it must come without hate. That when we are telling somebody that what they are doing is wrong, and we must, because that is the only way our transgressions will ever be corrected, we must do so in a manner which is coming from a place of love and respect, not from a place of hate. If we are shouting at a person with hate in our heart, it is not rebuke. And so it will not be heard and it will not remedy anything. So first, settle your heart, ensure that your words are coming for the benefit of the person that you are rebuking, no matter how bad they are. And at least we have a chance then to curtail whatever it is they are doing, which is such a transgression. Verse 18, You are not to take vengeance. You are not to retain anger or bear a grudge against the sons of your kinspeople, meaning the other members of the community, but be loving to your neighbor as one like yourself. Le'acha kamocha, right? You have to actually treat your neighbor as yourself. And this is one of the great commandments for love. We get the ahavta a few times in the Torah, once for loving God, once for loving our neighbor, and also for loving the stranger. Of course, this is a central passage that I've talked about before, so we're going to keep moving. Verse 19. My laws you are to keep. Your animal you are not allowed to mate in two kinds. Your field you are not to sow with two kinds. A garment of two kinds of shatnez is not to go on you. All right. And there was our second major lane change. And I'm willing to wager, because I know when I was first reading this many, many years ago, I didn't pick up on it either, that it doesn't seem like it is saying very much different than the previous verses, or that is to say, the manner in which it is speaking. It's another mitzvah. We've talked about stealing, we've talked about gossip, we've talked about rebuke, and now we're talking about our animals, our fields, and our clothing. I mean, it's just part of the list, right? But the underlying question is, why the preamble here in verse 19? Et chukotai, right? My laws or my statutes. There are many different translations for the underlying word chok. And we'll keep laws or statutes or ordinances. It's complicated, as we'll see. But the question that we have to ask is, why are these particular phrases, our particular mitzvot, being introduced with this phrase? Why suddenly act as though we are starting the list? We're in the middle of a chapter, and we've already gone through many of God's laws in the broadest sense of the word law. So why suddenly say, these you're going to keep? It comes out of nowhere. Now, we are going to look into some explanations for why a chok might be different. And in particular, we're going to focus on the concept of shatnez. Now, shatnez is a weird word, and we'll talk about that too. But in practice, what it means is not wearing clothing that has been made from a combination of wool and linen. Wool, of course, comes from sheep. Linen comes from flax, and it is considered a prohibition to wear something that is blended together from them. And we'll talk about that in more detail in our commentary. And the other two, however, I also want to make sure we understand. To sow your field with two kinds, there's a prohibition on mixing the seeds with our crops in the furrows in our fields. And then of mating two kinds, you might be thinking, well, wait, if they can mate, then they're not two kinds. And you're probably remembering your biology class. And in our biology class, at least if it was like mine, they talked about one of the important elements of a species is that a species can mate with itself, but it can't mate with a different species. And while that is generally true, it is not a perfect one-to-one match. That is to say, there are sometimes things that we call different species that are able to mate with each other. The most famous, of course, are a donkey and a horse. A donkey and a horse can mate, and they create what is called a mule. And a mule is sterile by birth. Also, lions and tigers can technically mate. Wasn't the kind of thing that got on all that much because they were in very different environments, but technically they can mate. And here in verse 19, we are saying that there are species that could mate, but we must preserve them as being separate species rather than mating them to each other. This has nothing to do with animal husbandry in terms of selective breeding within a particular species. So if you want to breed your horses to be healthier, and you pick the healthiest stallion and the healthiest mare you've got, and so you'll have healthier offspring, that's considered perfectly fine. We know that Jacob, when he was trying to recover his wages from Lavan, used techniques to try and make sure the goats would have the coloration of their wool that he needed for them to become part of his flocks. So animal husbandry, perfectly fine, but cross-species mating, not so fine. I should also point out that animal husbandry does have a limit when it comes at the expense of the animal. That is to say, especially in some of the more show breeds of cats or dogs, when they are bred to have unrealistic body proportions and ones that will create difficulty, such as the excessive short nose of a pug, which can give it extreme difficulty in breathing, or with excessive inbreeding that creates genetic and other physiological defects in the animal, which might look good on a pedestal, but it creates a terrible life for the animal. Those are things that Judaism absolutely frowns upon. I also want to point out that while we are allowed animal husbandry with the health of the animal in mind, we do not engage in eugenics. That is to say, we do not use the same standard as some form of forced breeding program for human beings, or, much to the shame of the United States, the forced sterilization of people that were considered undesirable. One of the darker periods in the American past, and one that we would do well to remember in order that we not repeat. So with that in mind, we are going to go ahead and jump into our commentary, because otherwise we might run out of time. And we're going to look in particular at this idea of shatnez, but also with its context, the other elements, as well as especially this introduction that these are the chukotai of why are we interrupting to reintroduce the idea that God is giving us laws. Isn't that what the Torah is all about? Okay, so with all of that, let's go ahead and jump into our commentary. And we are going to begin with, and I cut it off, Ibn Ezra. It's not just Ibn, which would just mean son. It is Ibn Ezra. And here is what he has to say about our mystery word shatnez. So of two kinds, what are we talking about? Well, the transmitters of tradition, meaning rabbi to rabbi to rabbi to rabbi, said that the word shatnez, two kinds, is made up of actually three words. That is to say that it is a metaphorical anacronym combining the words shu'ah, havui, and nuz, which would mean hackled, spun, and twined, meaning any of the different ways that the fabrics might be blended together. So it's an acronym, much like the word Tanakh itself, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, and is brought together. However, Ibn Ezra recognizes that this is a midrashic interpretation, and instead offers that this is probably what we would call a five-letter root. Now, Hebrew normally has three-letter root words. That is to say, the shoresh, the root, is made up of three consonants that are then always kept in that order, and then are added to with prefixes, suffixes, and different vowels to give us the different forms of that concept. However, there are a few four-letter root words. Five-letter root words, well, what he's basically saying here is that no part of this word can be deconstructed. The shin is not added as a prefix. The zayin at the end is not added as a suffix. That the whole word is the whole word. And it's kind of weird. And it just means mixed. And as he points out, this is a noun which stands alone in Scripture, meaning shatnez is just there. It doesn't come in any other form. It doesn't have any other conjugations. It just is. And that makes it tricky. As we see from the Women's Commentary on the Torah, a recent resource, the word shatnez, the word's precise meaning is really actually unclear. We normally can untangle, pardon the weaving pun, the roots of a word and find where that word has commonality with other words in Torah or the rest of Tanakh, or sometimes even in other languages. But it appears the word shatnez in the Bible only here and Deuteronomy 22:11, which spells it out that we're talking specifically about wool and linen. The Torah gives us no other context for this word. And languages related to Hebrew seem to lack a similar word. Oftentimes, this is a great academic exercise to see if other ancient Semitic languages or just neighboring languages, even if they're not Semitic, have the same word or similar words that we could then learn. Perhaps there was a shared understanding. It's not always a one-to-one by any stretch of the imagination. The same way that if you happen to see a word in French, that does not mean that it means the same thing that it means in English, but it does mean they probably have a similar origin, and you might be able to get at least a clue, but don't expect it to be one-to-one. Well, with shatnez, we don't even have that. There is really nothing going on to explain what this word means other than the fact that it's here about mixture, and the fact that wool and linen are spelled out in Deuteronomy, and the fact that it's talking about the context of these hukim and the overall mixture of what appear to be different species, whether it be animals, plants, or now fabrics. So we're just going to have to work with shatnez as being a mixture of wool and linen, like Deuteronomy states, and that there is some issue with it. But obviously, that is the deep question. Why is there an issue with this? We might be able to imagine a simple explanation for the mixture of species. Maybe there's something weird about mixing horses and donkeys that we are going to avoid. I mean, after all, the mule is sterile. Maybe there's a problem with mixing plant species. I don't know. It's harder for me to come up with something. And then third, I on my own, I can't come up with any reason why we don't mix wool and linen. I mean, it doesn't seem to suggest an idea. If we went back through our chapter 19 readings from just this morning or now afternoon, if somebody said, why do you think God said don't steal? I'm sure that we could easily come up with some reasons for why we don't steal. If it said why we shouldn't hate somebody, or why we should provide tochacha, rebuke, criticism to people in a healthy manner, why we should avoid gossip, all of those, I'm sure that any one of us could come up with at least a potential explanation for what the benefit is from observing this mitzvah is, and possibly even why that might be at the heart of what God was hoping to accomplish by giving us that commandment. These three and many other parts of Torah, well, they are chukim, specifically in our tradition, because they do not easily suggest a reason for why they were commanded or the benefit that comes from their observance. And that is something that we're now going to have to wrestle with. What is the intention behind this? What are we gaining from this? What was God hoping to accomplish by making this part of the fabric of Torah? I'll try to resist the shatnez puns, but well, you all know me. Language is too much fun. All right, so let's look at Chizkuni, and he's going to give us I think, a pretty straightforward explanation for why we might have prohibited the mixing of these two garments, two fabrics. The reason behind this prohibition is to distinguish the garments worn by priests from those worn by ordinary Israelites. The priests having been specifically ordered to wear some garments containing a mixture of wool and linen. So first of all, wait, we're being prohibited from wearing this, but just in the book of Exodus, when we read all about the construction of the Mishkan and the clothing of the priests, we were ordered to mix wool and linen for their garments. So, well, we'll come back to why they got ordered to do that, but for the moment, Chizkuni is suggesting that since they were ordered to wear that mixture, the rest of us have to show a distinction by not copying their clothing. We find something similar, he explains, with regard to the prohibition of certain fat parts offered on the altar and all kinds of blood, as well as the oil used for anointing the kings of the house of David, or the incense in certain proportions. All of the aforementioned are for the exclusive use in the service of the Lord by the priests. Anyone making personal use of them is as guilty of severe trespass as someone making personal use of the king's scepter. All right, so Chizkuni lays it out in, I think, a fairly straightforward and psychologically compelling manner, which is to say, since the priests are obligated to wear wool and linen, then if we wore wool and linen blend, we would be trespassing on their domain. We would be acting in a way which was too similar to what they are required to do and what is reserved for them. Like the use of blood on the altar, like certain fats that we can't eat but were offered up as sacrifices, like the special formulas used for the oil and incense, all of these things had to be distinct if they were to remain sacred, if they were to remain special. And Hiskuni finishes off with something that all of us might recognize, which is to say, the king is going to be pretty unhappy if he used his scepter as a backscratch, right? If he sat on the king's throne, even when he wasn't there, generally speaking, that was considered a death sentence in most cultures throughout the world, precisely because having that distinction, having that exclusivity made us bear it with more respect, or in this case, bear the king more respect. So by having this reserved activity, the wearing of the wool and linen mix, we are in fact acknowledging the kingship of God, that we are recognizing that God has set aside certain things for the priest and certain things for the rest of us. And we are not going to cross that line, because to do so would be to violate the king's rule. And the king here, of course, being God. And we can find that as an analog with human kings, but that is the short of it for Hiskuni's explanation. All right. Hopefully I didn't confuse you all too much there. Let's go ahead and move into Ramban, Nachmanides' explanation. As soon as I find my mouse, there we go. Now, the reason for the prohibition of mingled stuff in garments is in order to keep far away from mixing together of different species. And he therefore prohibited the threads of wool and linen from which garments are usually made. All right, so first explanation on the surface is that we shouldn't mix things, and therefore we don't mix the wool and linen. Okay, but that's a little too generic. After all, if we're not supposed to mix things, well, then what about mixing water and wine together, which was the normal way of preparing wine in the ancient world? What about mixing flour and water together to make bread? I mean, we obviously are going to mix things together. Why would it be wrong to mix them in my kitchen, but or okay to mix them in my kitchen, but wrong to mix them in my clothing? It feels like an arbitrary line, which is kind of the point, but that's what he's highlighting here. However, he's going to suggest that Rambam, also known as Maimonides or Moshe ben Maimon, has another explanation for this. But the rabbi, and this is his deferential term for Rambam, said in Moreh Nevuchim, the guide for the perplexed, that the reason for the prohibition of wearing a garment made of wool and linen is because at the time, meaning at the time the mitzvah was first being given, this kind of garment was used by the priests and magicians to adorn themselves in performing their activities. And he, Maimonides, says that he found it so written in their books. And since this was for them a matter of great importance and very much desired by them in order that they should do their activities in honor of the idols and demons, therefore the Torah removed it from being worn by all people, since the Torah intends to blot out their deeds and efface their memory. All right, so Maimonides explains, and Ramban is quoting that explanation a little more succinctly than Rambam himself, that the specific prohibition on the wearing of wool and linen was an anti-idolatry legislation. That it wasn't that our priests were wearing it, although they did, that made it a problem. The problem was the priests of idols wore it, and the people who were doing all of their magic and witchcrafty kind of things would wear it as part of their ensemble, showing their command over the world. And since they made it as such a prominent status kind of element of their repertoire, we have to stay far away from it. Now, this is something that we can see in other ways reflected in other activities. For example, as pretty as it would be to have a pine tree with lights on it in my house, I'm not going to be doing that. Not because I object to pine trees with lights, but because that is a iconic element of a different religion. And therefore, I cannot imitate the iconic element of that religion, even if I were doing it for an innocent reason, just for pure decoration. Likewise, we have refrained for a very long time in most Jewish communities from performing our vows all the way down to the ground, as we did once in the ancient world, because again, that form of protestation straight to the ground has become heavily associated with other faiths. And as such, we don't want to give the impression that we are doing the same thing as they are doing. And so we have modified some of our practice. So Rambam through Ramban is giving us our second explanation. It is not about distancing ourselves from what our priests do. It is about removing ourselves from even the hint of the idolatrous practices. All right, two excellent reasons, but not the only two. As always in Judaism, there is much more that might be used as an explanation. All right, now, for the next explanation, you're going to have to buckle up because we are moving into a more esoteric, a more Kabbalistic reading of all of this. Now, obviously, I am not trying to privilege any one explanation over another. I am not the ultimate arbiter of which commentary was right and which was wrong. And I believe that there is truth that can be learned and wisdom to be used from all of them. So if you find that one is more satisfying than the other, that is fine, but do try to learn from all of them, even those that perhaps you find less appealing or less compelling in their explanatory effectiveness. So let's see what we can do here. Mixing species has been forbidden on 3 different levels. Different animals must not be mated with one another, regardless of whether biologically such mating could produce offspring, like horses and donkeys. 2, plants must not be mixed together by planting seeds together or by grafting branches onto tree trunks. And 3, certain clothing, that is to say, flax and sheep's wool, must not be woven together and worn, stitched together and worn or serve as sheets, pillows, etc. We can't use it in any of those forms. Now, the reason that regardless of outcome, animals must not be mated together is because animals mate in much the same way as humans. Plants must not be mixed together at the point of planting or grafting, as the woman of the human species is compared to the field. That is to say, it receives input of seed passively. The reason that the mixing of the 2 fibers, flax meaning linen with lamb's wool, is prohibited is that Cain, that is to say Cain from the biblical story, offered flax as his offering to the Lord, and Hevel, also known as Abel in English, offered sheep's wool. Okay, hopefully you're a little lost, because a little confusion is always a good thing. It means that you're about to learn something that you didn't already know. Doesn't mean you have to agree with it, but it does mean that you are at least going, wait, what? And that confusion is perfectly fine. It doesn't have to turn into immediate rejection of how dare you teach me something I've never heard. Instead, it should be, all right, let's see where this goes. So let's see where this goes. Essentially, the underlying theory here is, notwithstanding the other explanations for the prohibition on the mixtures, we can also see that as a prohibition on how we view the generation of life. That is to say that when we see 2 animals mixing cross species, we are reflecting on something that is similar to how humans behave. And while humans of all types are welcome to mix and come together, we do recognize that there are distinctions within. Of course, human and animal, obviously, is one of the prohibitions mentioned in the Torah. But in general, there are many other limits to our behavior. Recognizing that with regards to animals helps strengthen that within ourselves. Likewise, although planting may feel like a perfectly isolated activity with no bearing whatsoever on human behavior, it is not so. The act of planting seed is indeed a strong metaphor for the act of impregnation within human beings. And as such, we need to maintain our focus even while scattering our plant seeds, so that when we are involved in a more intimate acts, we are also doing it correctly. But the third explanation, the one about shatnez, is the one that I found most compelling and the one that I think we want to discuss in more detail, which is the Cain and Abel story. If you take yourself back to the story of Cain and Abel, you'll remember that when Cain brought his sacrifice before God, he brought vegetable matter. And when Abel brought his sacrifice before God, he brought the best of his flock. Well, we are seeing here a comparison of the vegetable matter, the linen, and the animal, the wool, reflected here. Now, seeing that Cain's offering was rejected, this was a hint that these two species, the vegetable and the animal, were not fit to be mixed with one another. The fact that Cain murdered his brother is seen as a warning that they could not have been full brothers, genetically speaking, that these truly are fundamentally different things. Hence, the Torah's prohibition of mixing flax and wool is a warning that genetic incompatibility is fraught with extreme danger. Now, the terms genetic are a modern translation. This is more talking about the fundamental essence of something, which, in my humble opinion, is not describing the physical nature, but is instead describing the underlying spiritual nature of a thing. Genetics, like I said, was not a medieval concept when the commentary was being written, but the essence of an object, the essence of a person certainly was. Seeing that it is Israel's task to be a holy nation, we must not do anything which would undermine accomplishing our task. When the Torah chose the wording, it must not ascend on you, as a way to describe the prohibition to not wear garments containing a mixture of wool and linen, this wording, awkward as it is, alludes to the spirit of impurity, which the wearer is not to put upon his person when he wears such a garment. So, as this is also echoed in the Zohar, what he is trying to say is that if we were to wear a garment that was mixed from wool and linen, we would essentially be trying to mix Cain and Abel and the essence of each of them at one time. And while it is perfectly fine to wear linen, even though that was Cain's offering, and obviously fine to wear wool individually, because each of those are a perfectly fine part of God's world, to try and act as though Cain and Abel could be perfectly mixed, perfectly brought together, is to upend the entire message that that story was trying to teach. That there is a way of being, which is a holy Cain way of being, that is incompatible with the mission of being Jewish. And as such, if we are to mix it with the element of Abel, then in that moment, only in the mixture, we are essentially trying to subvert the entire mission that Judaism has, which is to celebrate what is right and to be far from that essential nature, that the propensity to violence, the propensity to greed, all of the elements that made Cain Cain, which we would be taking on, we would be literally wrapping ourselves in, were we to wear these as a mixed item. Again, it doesn't happen when we're wearing them as individuals. Pure wool, pure linen, or any other type of fabric mixture is perfectly fine. Your polyester blends, go for it. However, when you are specifically wearing the elements of Cain and the elements of Abel together, you are essentially saying, I am ignoring the difference between these two elements in the world. And it's kind of like saying Cain did nothing wrong. I am fully a child of Cain as much as I am a child of Abel. Now, the Torah tells us that's not physically true in any case, because all of Cain's progeny were wiped out by the flood. But spiritually, psychologically, culturally, being a child of Cain is, of course, possible. And that is something we have to stay far away from. Let's keep going. There we go. I think I can get it. Yes. This leaves us with the question of why the Torah not only permitted, but commanded the mixture of these two fibers when it ordered the blue tzitzit, the fringes, of our 4 strings of the fringes be made of wool, even if the bulk of the garment it is attached to is made of linen. So it is true that not only were the Kohanim commanded to wear a mixed garment, but we do have an element of permission to wear a mixed garment ourselves if our tzitzit are made of wool and we are attaching them to a linen talit, the actual cloth cloak part of the garment. So as the editor points out, that word techelet, that particular type of blue, is not just the color, but it is also the wool dyed in that color, which is why tzitzit are always made of wool. So the garments of the priest contain mixtures of wool and linen as a matter of routine, especially the ones worn when they perform the service in the tabernacle. So if, as Rabbeinu Bachya said in his first paragraph, we are so worried about blending Cain and Abel together in our clothing, why are we allowed to do that in our tzitzit, and why are the Kohanim commanded to do so in their garments when they are officiating in the temple? All right, excellent question, Rabbeinu Bachya. Let's see about the answer. In fact, this is the mystical dimension of Solomon, describing the ideal wife-mother weaving wool and linen in Proverbs 31, also known as Eshet Chayil. It's a beautiful poem that is recited in Jewish homes on Friday evening. And while it is meant as well to describe the lady of the house, it is also meant to describe deeper spiritual truths beyond the particulars of the person there. So according to the mystical dimension, the words in that verse, she seeks wool and flax, puts them together, and works with her hands willingly, reflects the mystique of the entire poem Solomon composed here about such a woman, the whole book, the whole chapter in Proverbs, or the whole end of that chapter. When the entire orientation of a person is to fulfill the will of the Creator, as the Eshet Chayil in that chapter is, as is the orientation of Eshet Chayil described by Solomon, then and only then, joining these symbolically diverse characters is permitted or even commanded. All right, so short answer, and then we'll get to his longer exposition of it. The short answer is that while we are ordered to keep far from that spirit of Cain, we also recognize that that spirit of Cain has to be redeemed, that there are threads of Cain that do belong to this world and which are needed to be woven back into the world. Now, generally speaking, we cannot do so safely. Generally speaking, it is a danger, it is a temptation, it is a trap for anyone to try to weave them together, which is why we keep them separate. But under the exact ideal conditions, it can be done, and in fact, needs to be done. The temple, of course, being one of those places where such conditions could be met, but also in other elements as well, as he will explain. It is the task of man to sublimate the evil influences in our universe, to place them directly into the service of the Lord. The Eshet Chayil, this woman of valor, is so named because this is what she does. Performing service in the tabernacle is designed to achieve optimal sanctity on earth. That is, to sublimate impurity, to take anything in the world that is impure and to render it pure and of holy use. The blue wool thread on the tzitzit is the reminder of the task of each one of us to make earth such a place where all evil has been sublimated, has been rehabilitated. Whatever goes on in the terrestrial temple on earth reflects what goes on in its counterpart in the celestial spheres. So this is one of the essences of the notion of tikkun olam in the Kabbalistic world, that there are elements within this world that are flawed and that are broken, that are wrapped behind a barrier of vice and of evil. But they are still sparks of God's creation. And as such, in the right moment, in the right way, they can be redeemed. They can be let loose. So, for example, the evil impulses that sometimes will lead a person to various sexual crimes can be sublimated and redeemed in a willing and loving partnership with a monogamous partner. And that means we do not have to absent ourselves from all of that activity. We have to instead refine it and direct it solely to the sacred task of being with somebody within that sacred relationship. So too, our appetite for food can be sublimated through the rules of kashrut and through the rules of ritual purity to allow ourselves to elevate those elements as well. It is not about removing the evil or running from things within us that might lead us to evil. It is about finding ways to tame that, to direct it, to restrain it from any of its negative consequences, but to then use it carefully to peel open that small opportunity for what is actually meant to be sacred or good that is adjacent to whatever is also a problem. Now, this is a very dangerous concept and one that has unfortunately led many people astray. There have been different groups throughout Jewish history, the Frankists most famously, which took this idea and let's just say ran with it to the idea that as long as you were a holy enough person, which, the leader, of course, was, that you could commit any sin in a way that would elevate the elements involved. Now, that is a complete fallacy. It is not accepted by Judaism at all, and it is something that has been a great shame for the people that involved themselves in those ideas. But the actual underlying notion here that there are opportunities occasionally, carefully, within the right setting to make sure that that element of creation that we are most afraid of can be redeemed is a powerful one. And when we look at that techelet, when we look at that blue on our tzitzit, we are reminding ourselves of that potential, and we are reminding ourselves of that danger. That sometimes we hang by a thread between touching something that will corrupt us or of holding on to something in a way that redeems it. Certainly something that requires additional thought, additional discussion, and not something that should ever be rushed into, but a powerful notion when we are choosing what we wear to remind ourselves of that. So as we look at these hukim, these laws, we can recognize that, yes, in a primal level, we are obeying them because God has commanded. And we are doing so without the benefit of our logic and reason to support it, which is a great act of submission to God's will. But there are indeed additional elements that can inspire us in the performance of these mitzvot, or the refraining of transgressing these mitzvot, so that when we are choosing, just with regards to our clothing, to not wear wool and linen blends, that we are specifically available to recognize that we are holding what the sacred temple had as being different than us, like Shizkuni, that we are, sorry, was that, that was Shizkuni, or was that Ibn Ezra? Hold on, I lost my thread. That we are able to, yes, separate them as Shizkuni mentioned, I was right. And we can also use it as a reminder of keeping ourselves far from idolatry, as Ramban, or as Rabbeinu Bachya says, we can use this as a reminder that there is a danger of falling into the trap of Cain, and that we do not wish to embrace Cain as a goal, but that doesn't mean that there isn't some opportunity for bringing that spirit too into the realm of God's light. All right. Thank you all for joining and studying together with me. I look forward to next week's study as well, especially as we are here in this time of the counting of the Omer, marching our way towards Sinai. Let us love and respect each and every word of Torah and see what we can find from each different phrase that God chose out of the infinite amount of things he could have said to share with us. Take care, everyone, and be well.